When I started studying the history of the Great Patriotic War, one thing always surprised me. Why was the Soviet Union able to win? After all, in the first months, it seemed that everything was lost. German troops were rapidly advancing deep into the country. Cities were burning one after another. Millions of people were captured or perished. And so I delved deeper and deeper into the archives, read memoirs, and studied documents. And I understood there was not one magical factor for victory. It is like a huge mosaic where every detail is important, where everything merged into one: economic might, military art, the national spirit, even the enemy's mistakes. We often hear simple answers. They say, "We won by number, overwhelmed the enemy with corpses," or conversely, "the Allies helped with their supplies." And someone mentions General Frost in the vast expanses. But the truth, as always, is more complicated and more interesting. Imagine a gigantic mechanism where dozens of gears are turning simultaneously. The evacuation of thousands of factories to the east, the round-the-clock work of the rear, brilliant military commanders, partisans in the forests, the resilience of ordinary soldiers. And when all this worked together, that very miracle began, which today is called the Great Victory. Today, I want to tell you precisely about this, not with dry figures and dates, but so that you can feel the grandeur of the events, so that you understand victory was not an accident, but the result of the incredible efforts of millions of people. Let us walk this path together from the retreat in the summer of the 41st until the spring of the 45th, when the red banner was raised over the Reichstag. When I first thought about how we managed to withstand the 41st at all, one thought struck me. The Germans advanced so swiftly that it seemed everything would collapse in a matter of weeks. The western border was burning, cities were surrendering one after another, and the front was rolling back further and further east. And now imagine this nightmare. Amidst the roar of artillery, under the howl of dive bombers, someone makes a decision of incredible boldness, not to retreat in panic, not to drop everything and run, but to save the factories. On the 24th of June, only on the third day of the war, a special body was created. The Evacuation Council. The name is simple, almost mundane, but behind it was an operation of such scale that the world did not even suspect. No country in the Second World War did anything like it, because it was not just about moving people away from the front line. It was necessary to move the industry itself, entirely, with all the machine tools, presses, melting furnaces, and metal stocks. On the 27th of June, a document appeared that defined what to evacuate, where, and in what order. Reading these lines today, you realize that people were working in a mode of extreme concentration. Every hour counted. The Germans surged forward, capturing 100, sometimes 200 kilometers per day. And Soviet engineers, managers, and workers had to manage to dismantle giant factories and move them before the enemy arrived. They evacuated primarily skilled workers, those who knew how to handle complex equipment: women, elderly people, youth, children. Everyone was divided into 5 priority groups. First came the collectives of entire factories, because only they could quickly launch production in a new location. Then the families of servicemen and pupils of orphanages, and a huge mass of people who evacuated themselves under their own power. But the main task was still industry. The western regions of the Soviet Union, where 40% of the population lived, were the most industrially developed. The main military factories were located there: tank, aviation, and artillery. To leave them to the enemy meant giving the enemy weapons against themselves. But simply blowing them up, destroying them, meant depriving one's own army of the ability to fight. There remained only one way out: to move them. And the operation began, which is difficult even to imagine today. During 2 stages of evacuation, from June of the 41st to February of the 42nd, and during the spring-summer of the 42nd, 2,743 enterprises were moved to the east. Of these, 1,523 were large factories. 550 were moved from Ukraine, 498 from Moscow and the Moscow region. 109 enterprises were evacuated from Belarus, 92 from Leningrad. Where were these factories taken? 667 went to the Urals, 322 to Siberia, 308 to Central Asia and Kazakhstan, 226 to the Volga region. Every figure behind this list represents echelons, kilometers of tracks, thousands of people. At peak moments, up to half of the country's entire rolling stock was used for the evacuation. Trains moved in a continuous stream, one train after another, day and night, under bombings, through ruined stations. For example, the Zaporizhdal factory, 8,000 carriages were needed for its removal. 8,000! Try to imagine this string. And there were hundreds of such factories. Machine tools, presses, entire workshops were dismantled under enemy fire. Workers labored until the last moment, until German tanks appeared on the outskirts of the city. Enemy aircraft flew overhead, bombs exploded nearby, yet people continued loading equipment into the carriages. Many traveled directly on platforms next to their machine tools. They gave up spaces in covered carriages to the elderly, women with children. They traveled 40 or 60 people per carriage, although the plan called for half as many. They traveled without food supplies, almost without belongings. Many left in such a hurry that they only took what they were wearing. Evacuation points were created along the entire route, places where one could receive hot food and medical assistance. Through the Penza evacuation point alone, nearly 400 echelons passed in less than a month, carrying 437,000 people. That is 15 to 18 trains every day. And the station canteen issued up to 20,000 servings of food per day. In total, over 20 million people moved to the east during the evacuation, 12.5 million in the first stage and 8 million in the second. This is 1/3 of the country's population. Imagine the scale. Entire cities were lifted from their location and moved thousands of kilometers. But the most amazing thing began afterwards. Echelons arrived in the Urals, in Siberia, and there, often in an open field under the open sky, production restoration began. In winter and severe frosts, workers warmed themselves by bonfires lit right between the machine tools. Women and teenagers took their places at equipment that experienced men had previously operated. They lived in dugouts, in barracks, sometimes right in unfinished workshops. And yet, they launched the factories in 1.5 to 2 months. By the beginning of the 42nd year, almost all evacuated enterprises were already operating. They were already producing tanks, aircraft, and shells. Without this, the Soviet Union would not have been able to fight for the next 4 years. Germany seized territories that produced 1/3 of the country's industrial output. If not for the evacuation, everything would have been lost. This operation became possible thanks to the industrialization of the 30s. Yes, it was carried out harshly, with excesses, but it was precisely that which created the industrial base in the East. When the war began, there were already power plants, railways, and factories under construction. The evacuated enterprises were placed not in emptiness, but on prepared sites, and this allowed work to be quickly established. By the end of the 42nd year, industry had not just recovered, it had surpassed the pre-war level. The Urals turned into the country's main arsenal, and it was there, deep within the country, far from the front line, that the main weapon of victory was forged. So the factories were evacuated, equipment was delivered, and production was launched. But that was only half the job. Now it remained to be proven. Soviet industry was capable not just of surviving, but of winning the economic war against Germany. The first war year became a real test. Industrial production almost halved. Imagine, 1/3 of the country is occupied. Factories are just starting to work in new locations. Skilled workers have gone to the front. And the armies need tanks, aircraft, guns, and shells right now, every day, more and more. But by the middle of the 42nd year, something hard to believe happened. Lost capacities were not just recovered, they were surpassed. The Soviet Union created a coordinated war economy capable of supplying the front in increasing sizes. Already by the end of the 42nd year, the army was receiving almost 2 times more weaponry than it was losing in battles. Think about this. For every lost tank, 2 new ones arrived. For every downed aircraft, 2.5. And in the 43rd year, a real breakthrough occurred. The gross output of the defense industry grew almost 3 times compared to the pre-war level. This is despite the fact that a significant part of the USSR's European territory still remained under the Germans. The Urals, Siberia, and the Volga region turned into a gigantic military factory, operating around the clock, 7 days a week. You know what is most striking? The efficiency of Soviet industry. For every 1,000 tons of smelted steel, Soviet factories produced 5 times more tanks and artillery pieces than German ones. For every 1,000 metal-cutting machine tools, 8 times more aircraft. This is not magic. This is rational organization of production. Soviet designers created weapons that were simple to manufacture, reliable, and mass-produced. Take, for example, the legendary 34. Series production began back in June of the 41st year. By the end of the year, 115 machines were produced. A few, right? But already in the 42nd, 12,500 tanks. In the 43rd, almost 16,000. And throughout the war years, more than 60,000 34s of all modifications. The Germans themselves acknowledged it as the best medium tank of the war. Sloped armor, a powerful 76mm cannon, a diesel engine, wide tracks. Simple, reliable, easily repaired right in the field. And most importantly, it could be made in the thousands. German Tigers and Panthers were technically more sophisticated but complex and expensive to produce. For one Tiger, there were 5 34s, and in this lay a particular philosophy of war. The heavy tanks KV and IS struck terror into the enemy. Their armor was difficult to penetrate, and their guns penetrated everything. The IS-3 with its powerful armament became the pinnacle of Soviet wartime tank building. Or take aviation. The Il-2 attack aircraft, the most mass-produced combat aircraft in history. It was nicknamed the Flying Tank for its armored cockpit. The Germans feared it to the core, calling it the Black Death. Simple to pilot, all-weather, effective against tanks and infantry. 23mm cannons and rocket projectiles turned German columns into piles of scrap metal. Fighters Yak-3, Yak-7, Yak-9, La-5, La-7. These machines gradually won the sky from the Luftwaffe. Bombers. P-2 Il-4 Tu-2 struck the enemy's rear. Soviet aviation industry produced aircraft in the thousands. If in the 42nd year the USSR produced almost 2 times more combat aircraft than Germany, the gap only increased later on. Artillery became the god of war. Graben system guns, simple, reliable, deadly. Light, medium, heavy guns, anti-tank weapons, all of this was produced in incredible quantities. In field artillery, the USSR surpassed Germany by more than 2 times. In mortars, by 5 times. In anti-tank weapons, by almost 3. And the famous Katyushas? Rocket salvo installations BM-8, BM-13, BM-31. Their salvos churned up enemy positions, sowed panic, and broke defenses. The Germans called them Stalin's organs for the characteristic howl of the shells. But weapons do not shoot by themselves. They need to be supplied with ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and food for the soldiers. And here the whole country was involved. Collective farms worked, giving almost the entire harvest to the state. Women, old people, teenagers stood at the machines for 12, 14, 16 hours. Labor productivity grew year by year, in the 42nd by 19%, in the 43rd by another 7%. The movement of 200ers, 300ers, and 1000ers covered the entire industry. People overfulfilled norms by 2, 3, 10 times. Not for awards, not for money, but for victory. They slept right in the workshops so as not to waste time commuting. They refused days off and vacations. They were underfed, cold, but they did their job. By the 43rd year, the picture became obvious. The USSR surpassed Germany in the production of tanks and self-propelled guns by almost 4 times, in combat aircraft, by almost 2, in guns of all calibers, by more than 3 in rifles, 3-fold. And this is despite the fact that the entire industry of occupied Europe was working for the Germans. French, Czech, Polish, Belgian factories were churning out equipment for the Wehrmacht, and the Soviet Union, with fewer resources, was overtaking the enemy. In the summer of the 42nd year, German intelligence reported to Hitler, The Russians are producing 1,000 tanks a month. He dismissed the report, saying it was unbelievable, and he was right. They were producing not 1,000 but 2,000 monthly, steadily throughout the 42nd, 43rd, and 44th years. Germany, during its maximum peak in May of the 44th, produced 1,450 tanks, almost half as many. This was a victory of the rear over the rear, of factories over factories, of people over circumstances. The Soviet economy, shifted onto a war footing, worked as a single mechanism, without hesitation, without reflection, without regard for the price. The whole country turned into one huge factory, forging the weapon of victory. When the air still smelled of the smoke of evacuation echelons, long threads of assistance, which were called by the simple and slightly dry word Lend-Lease, stretched into the country across oceans and mountain passes. It was a state program of Allied supplies without prepayment, with settlements made only after the war, essentially to borrow in order to survive and win. I like to think of this aid not as a magic wand, but as a competent amplifier for an already playing orchestra. The Soviet melody sounded powerfully, and the Allied trumpets added timbres and volume at the right moment, especially where domestic reserves and capacities were painfully thinning out. The routes of this aid were different in character and mood. Harsh Arctic convoys under the north wind, the warm and long Persian route through Iran, the proprietary, almost domestic Pacific route to the Far East, and further along the Trans-Siberian Railway, and also the heavenly ribbon of Alsib, where aircraft were ferried across Alaska and Siberia. If you listen to the geography, almost half of the cargo came by sea across the Pacific Ocean. Another large share passed through the Persian corridor, a significant part through the Arctic, and a small part across the Black Sea, and in these shares, a simple logic is audible. Where it is shorter and safer, there the main track was laid. Alsib was like a trail between storm clouds. New airfields were built, an air bridge appeared on the map, and thousands of aircraft were ferried along it. It was the calm, patient work of technicians, pilots, and dispatchers, piecing the sky together for every subsequent machine. It is better to speak softly about the composition of the cargo, with respect for the details. The Allies sent hundreds of thousands of trucks and jeeps, which made our armies more mobile and connected the front with the rear as if new veins had been sewn onto it. Communications arrived, radio stations, telephone sets, cable, so that orders would arrive quickly and without a whisper, and this saved lives no worse than armor, because a timely command sometimes weighs more than a steel sheet. Food arrived, concentrates, canned meat, sugar, powdered milk, simple food that kept the soldiers on their feet and allowed the rear to shift an extra sack of grain to where it was more needed for the factory canteen. Machine tools, bearings, rails, locomotives, carriages came through. Everything that the massive engine of the rear revolves on, subtly but persistently, and without which a tank long remains merely a beautiful casting. There were also things rarely remembered, although they smell of victory itself. High-quality aviation gasoline arrived in such volumes that it became comparable to domestic supplies and even surpassed them during the most acute periods. This means that the aircraft took off when needed, not when luck smiled upon the fuel supply. There is also a rhythm of time in this story. Most of the cargo arrived not in the very first desperate year, but in the subsequent ones, when the Allied countries fully deployed their logistics and every route became well-worn rather than exploratory. And then the streams grew stronger, longer, and wider. This does not diminish the first steps. It is just that at the beginning of any road, there is no packed rut, and every caravan takes longer, learns to circumvent storms, and gains courage and experience from sailors, pilots, and railway workers. And one more detail. So that the cargo would travel under the Soviet flag and not get stuck in foreign port rules, the Allies transferred hundreds of ships. This was a practical measure in which confidence is heard that the captain and crew would deliver everything themselves. When you look closely at Lend-Lease, you see not only boxes and crates, you see how the Army's very gait changes. Columns stretch faster, headquarters hear the front more clearly, and the stoker at a distant factory is confident that the new cutter will arrive on time. And you see how the rear begins to breathe a little more smoothly. If canned goods and flour have arrived, you can shift your own bread to the workers' canteens. If machine tools and instruments have arrived, you can accelerate the production of guns and armored hulls. And if a communication link has arrived, you can reduce chaos and multiply order. Thus, aid becomes not foreign bread, but part of a common economy, in which every screw and every can of stew is incorporated into the channel of the great river called victory. But truth requires speaking about the measure as well. For the main types of weapons, tanks, aircraft, artillery, Soviet industry carried the lion's share, while foreign machines and weapons supplemented, closed bottlenecks, and accelerated where domestic machinery was not yet keeping up. Both controversial figures and differing memories harnessed themselves to the Lend-Lease effort, but a calm view sees in it exactly what it was. A serious support, arrived at the right hour to those who were already marching and had no intention of stopping. And perhaps the most important thing in the feeling of this chapter, the aid worked because there were people to receive it, unpack it, integrate it into the routine, and ensure that at dawn, the next echelon would depart for the front already with this new strength inside. When I recall how the very manner of our warfare changed, I always imagine the silence of the headquarters before dawn, maps on the table, tiredness and focus on the faces and in the commanders' minds, a simple sense of responsibility for thousands of lives and for the next step forward of the entire country. And it was in this silence that the art of winning was born, not by the strength of steel alone, but by the precision of thought and the ability to hear the front, just as a musician hears the orchestra in the darkness of the hall. The first difficult year taught commanders and staff officers that haste strikes at the vital areas, and the skill of calculating the rhythm of battle, from a short strike to a long pursuit, can be more important than menacing words. And only then, when the armies began to breathe more evenly, they were led forward by a circle of strong military leaders, each with their own voice and their own way of taking a blow. To feel their weight, it is useful to look back for a minute. Retreats were replaced by stopping the enemy, then came the school of defense with counterattack. And after that, wide operations, where each army had its own note. And one of the main parts belonged to Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky, and Ivan Stepanovich Konev. Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov knew how to bring order to the most anxious hours, and this was not a dry order, but the clear breathing of the entire system. He arrived where things were tenuous and gathered the defense into a fist, helping people believe that even the steepest wave would recede if met correctly. In Leningrad, in a short time, he linked the artillery of the front and the fleet into a unified network, pinned the enemy to the ground with fire, and prevented a breakthrough where the city was especially vulnerable. And in these decisions, his calm resolve and ability to see the whole in fragmented signals were audible. Near Moscow, he managed to build a defense so that a strong ridge was formed from disparate parts, and then transitioned to a counterattack, shattering the enemy's confidence in his own invulnerability and reminding the entire front that initiative favors a steady hand and a clear head. Zhukov was not a magician. He was a master of preparation, concentrating forces where the outcome is decided, not spreading strikes along the entire line, not chasing easy glory, but doing difficult work systematically and with a taste for accuracy. And this demonstrated the school of a person for whom discipline of thought is more valuable than loud promises. His strength lies in the ability to say, stop, to senseless haste and forward where a real opportunity opens up. And therefore other military leaders were drawn to his decisions, feeling support, just as a pedestrian feels a stone underfoot on a shaky path. And although in the national memory the defense of the capital and the northern city stand primarily behind him, his contribution to major offensives is no less important, where he helped assemble the general score so that each branch of the military entered on time and in the right key. Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky, that is a different intonation, softness in voice, and toughness in calculation, the habit of listening to people and the habit of standing his ground if reason dictates it. And therefore his decisions often turned out to be that calm, let's wait, which saves strength and yields more than a fiery immediately. In the spring before the Kursk Bulge, he insisted on deep defense and powerful reserves, explaining that the enemy's strength would run into resistance and exhaust itself, and then our hour would come. And this seemingly simple reasoning became the nerve of the entire campaign. The enemy choked, and then our confident offensive began. When the time came for a wide summer strike to the west, his troops, as part of the Belarusian direction in the operation bearing the name of an old Russian military leader, cut deep into the enemy's defense, surrounded large forces, and led forward a long wave of liberation. And all this with that very calmness that values not outward effect, but purity of execution. Rokossovsky has another characteristic: precision in the temporal arrangement of forces. He knew how, like a good conductor, to give the troops the necessary pause, and then raise them to the attack when the score was mature. And therefore his formations often moved quickly but without fuss, leaving behind not only kilometers, but also clear order in what was achieved. In the concluding act of the war, his front covered the main strike on the enemy's capital from the north, pinning down large forces and not allowing them to depart to assist the city garrisons. And in this role too, his ability to think not only about his sector, but about the whole picture at once is audible. Such work is inconspicuous on posters, but very noticeable in staff calculations, and in that rare feeling of confidence when neighbors know their flank is being held strongly and intelligently. Ivan Stepanovich Konev brought speed and plasticity to the common effort, for which he was respected even by those who favored drawn-out decisions. His armies moved widely, took rivers immediately, knew how to carve a path through defense knots without losing tempo, and this likened his style to that of a good field navigator who loves not only the line on the map, but also the terrain underfoot. In the final stage of the war, he conducted two major campaigns, from the Vistula to the Oder and from the Oder to the enemy's capital, and then, not allowing fatigue to take hold, turned part of his forces south to aid the rebellious city. And this turn showed how subtly he sensed time, distance, and the cost of delay. The meeting on the Elbe became not only a symbol of alliance, but also a sign that his front had traveled the path quickly and thoughtfully, carefully bringing along the entire cumbersome mechanics of supply and communication, without which no arrow on the map reaches its target. To understand why these three led troops so differently and yet so similarly, one must quietly utter two words: operational art. This is the ability to combine fire, maneuver, and time as if assembling a calendar from different seasons. And in this work, everyone had their own close instrument. For some, precise preparation. For others, a flexible pause. For yet others, speed and change of direction. Theory in itself is just a neat notebook, but the hands of the commanders transformed it into living action. Depth of defense, introduction of reserves, the juncture of infantry and tanks, decentralized artillery preparation, all of this ceased to be dry words and became the customary breathing of large operations. And when you look at this trio from the distance of years, you understand a simple thing. They were very different, but they knew how to communicate with each other in the language of action, and therefore the general score sounded smooth, even when each part demanded its own tempo and color. Other masters remained in their shadow: Alexander Mikhailovich Vasilevsky, Rodion Yakovlevich Malinovsky, Ivan Kristoforovich Bagramyan, Fyodor Ivanovich Tolbukin. And this is a reminder that war is not a solo concert, but a large orchestra where the soloist does not drown out the neighbors, but allows them to enter on time and at full strength. The main thing, however, is that they taught an entire country the simple craft of victory: to wait when necessary, and to go when it is time to go, not to look for easy trails, and not to be afraid of long roads. And in this craft, a quiet voice of responsibility is heard, which even today helps distinguish courage from fuss. That is why their names live not only in textbooks, but also in our everyday memory, as examples that firm thought and a calm heart can hold even the heaviest line and lead through it to where the light begins to appear. Sometimes, it seems that every great war has its own internal music. First, anxious notes, then confident chords, and finally, a powerful culmination, after which silence falls. And this line of the path can be heard from the Moscow snows to the capital streets of Berlin. Here, it is important not to retell the calendar, but to feel how, step by step, the breathing of a huge army and an entire country returned, and how the resolve to move forward without looking back was born from defense. Every turning point was not only on the map, but also in the people. After the first victories, soldiers began to look at the horizon differently, and commanders learned to trust their own hand when drawing arrows for future operations with a pencil. Near Moscow, everything stopped for the first time and reversed, like an icy river in which solid ground was found and pushed off from all at once. And this halt became not just a military success, but the destruction of the myth of the enemy's invincibility. Counterattacks at the capital's boundaries showed that the defense could not only hold out but also generate an offensive. And this feeling, like the first breath after a long run, is sharp and unforgettable. The world saw that the enemy's lightning plan was falling apart, and this was noticeable not only in the reports but also in the caution of those who watched the Eastern Front from afar. Stalingrad became a different truth, not about speed, but about resilience. When the city was held for every room, and the dust from explosions lay so thick that it seemed as if the very time of the city had become thicker and heavier. Where it seemed that forces were running out, the trap of encirclement unfolded, and the enemy himself ended up in a tight ring. And in the news, for the first time in a long time, words were heard not only about defense, but also about the complete defeat of a large grouping. From that time on, initiative began to be pronounced with emphasis on the first word, not to retreat, but to preempt, not to react, but to force the enemy to guess the next move. The Kursk Bulge became an exam in maturity, where the prepared depth of defense met the blow as coolly as an experienced boxer meets an exchange. And right there, in the hot grass, the time for a counterattack was measured out. The roar of the largest tank collision, where iron sparked like stones under a hammer, was not just a duel of machines. It was a judgment on the enemy's confidence in his novelties, and the verdict sounded quietly: technology will not save if a system stands against it. From Kursk, the road became wider and smoother. Not isolated units marched forward, but thoughtful offensives, where map operators and field commanders spoke the same language. When the time came for the Belarusian operation named after the old Russian military leader, the concept unfolded simultaneously in several directions so smoothly, as if an orchestra had struck a chord without a single false note. The enemy army group was cut, surrounded, and deprived of support, and the front suddenly looked like cracked glass that could no longer be patched with either an order or reinforcements. This strike, coinciding with the Allied offensive in the West, essentially delivered the verdict on the entire war, leaving the enemy only with the question of the timing and cost of the inevitable end. It is important to understand, from Moscow to Stalingrad, from Stalingrad to Kursk, from Kursk to the Belarusian summer, this is not a chain of accidents, but the maturation of the manner of warfare, where artillery fire, tank movements, and sapper work formed a unified pattern. Each victory raised not only the flags on the maps, but also the inner voice of the soldiers, which spoke simple words: we can, we will make it, we will press on. And in these words there was more steel than in armor. Thus, the psychology changed as well. The enemy began to think about preservation, and ours, about completion, and the difference between these thoughts widened with each passing month. And now came the last heavy and inevitable road to the enemy's capital, where the city had been turned into a fortress and every street into a line of defense. The assault required not only strength but also patience, crossings, reconnaissance, layering of defense, feints. All of this came together in the short days when long years were being decided. There was no place for easy glory there, but there was a place for completion. And when the banners were raised over the central buildings, it became clear that the music of the war had reached its final note. If you look back at all these battles as one long road, it becomes visible that it had a clear meaning. First, to stop, then to turn the tide, then to deprive the enemy of support and reach the place where he is forced to admit defeat. This logic was not born instantly. It was formed from lessons and persistence, and therefore there are so few accidents and so much labor in it. And furthermore, there is much quiet strength of people for whom going to the end was not a slogan, but a habit of keeping the word given to comrades and to themselves. Each of these turning points was important in itself, but altogether they created that very sense of irreversibility when the air already smells not only of gunpowder, but also of the impending silence after the battle. From the Moscow snow to the Berlin pavement, this is the path not only of the army, but also of character, which learned not to retreat internally before learning to win externally. And therefore, recalling these names, one wants to speak first of all not about glory, but about endurance, because it was precisely endurance that became that invisible bridge that led from the first solid stop to the last confident step. Sometimes it is thought that war has not only the roar of cannons, but also the quiet work of silence, where the forest hides the trail and the rail rings even before the train arrives. And it was in this silence that the force called partisan warfare grew, the force of people who decided to fight without parades and drums, but persistently and every day. To understand how it all began, it is enough to recall one short but very clear directive. At the end of the first summer month, the government and the party ordered the creation of detachments and sabotage groups in the captured lands to make the enemy's life unbearable, to disrupt his plans, and to strike him where he considered himself safe. This was not a beautiful slogan, but a practical plan. To form nuclei of resistance from locals, connect them with the rear, teach them how to hide and scavenge, listen to the railway, calculate the guard's stride, and know the enemy's weak spot. Not much time passed, and the partisan map became dense, like a starry sky without the moon. Thousands of detachments and formations operated throughout the occupied territory, and the total number of participants, together with the underground workers, was calculated in the hundreds of thousands, approaching the mark of about 1 million people. Most often, they were seen in the Belarusian, Ukrainian, Smolensk, Leningrad, and Kalinin forests. But the same resilient force also rose in the Russian regions, where, even without large forests, people found their own way to fight. On the embankment, near bridges, near warehouses, and depots. This was a people's war in the simplest sense. Someone fought with weapons, someone carried bread and clothing, someone hid the radio operator, and someone led through the swamp along a secret trail that only locals knew. What the partisans did most often and most accurately was break the rhythm of the railway, because war is nourished by the rail, and if you break it in the right place, the big machine starts coughing and loses count. By the middle of the war, this idea became a common cause. Dozens of brigades and individual detachments went on a rail hunt simultaneously, turning every kilometer of track into a question of, will it make it in time for any echelon carrying manpower and ammunition? And every time a detonation roared, the front received not just a minute of silence, it received a day and sometimes a week of advantage, because without a moving train, the enemy's map quickly loses meaning. This craft reached a special scale in the large operation that was nicknamed the Rail War. In it, experience, coordination, and patience converged, and the strike itself stretched from the northern forest to the wide Polisi swamps. About 100,000 partisans from hundreds of brigades and detachments participated in the operation, and already on the first night, they tore the fabric of the track so much that the count reached tens of thousands of damaged rails. And in many sectors, the enemy felt for the first time that his long road had become short. Then the strike continued and was systematically developed. The next wave came to replace the one, and together these two campaigns, moving like two beats of one melody, were calculated in hundreds of thousands of damaged rails and hundreds of disrupted transports. What these figures meant in the life of the front is clear without loud words. The capacity of the roads decreased. It became harder for reserves to reach the needed sector, and in the enemy headquarters, the neat arrows on the movement schedules faded. Separate districts turned into quiet zones, where movement had to be covered by entire security units. And this was the best victory of the forest over the wheel, because guarding the tracks does not fight on the front line and does not save the defense. Sometimes, for entire weeks in certain directions, the number of trains dropped so much that local garrisons spoke of a hole in the supply, and this hole was in itself a small victory for those who knew how to wait and strike at the right time. Besides the rails, the partisans had another quiet profession. reconnaissance, and it grew with experience. Reports on garrisons, crossings, airfields, and warehouses went to the front, and every such paper saved foreign blood and added accuracy to the artillery map. Interaction with regular units became closer and closer. Planned sabotage was tied to the days and even hours of large operations, so that the strike from the front would meet the enemy already tired, exposed, and with poor communication. Thus, the partisans became not free hunters, but a real branch of arms that was included in the overall concept, quietly but meaningfully, like turning on the right register of an organ, so that all the music falls upon the hall smoothly and without dissonance. Sometimes I'm asked to briefly explain why it worked, and the answer is always one. Because it was a people's war, in which the locals knew every bump, every clearing, every smell of yeen over their river, and in this homeliness, the freedom of maneuver was born, inaccessible to the invader. Behind the detachment stood the residents. They fed, hid, treated, warned, and without this, it is unthinkable to imagine the endurance with which the partisan regions lived throughout all those long months and years. Therefore, the memory of the partisans always sounds broader than the memory of fighters in the forest. It is the memory of the land that did not surrender, and of the people who did not step aside even when there were 1,000 reasons to do so. By the end of the war, the experience became a clear system. From forming brigades to air supply and complex communications, from calibrated mining of tracks to simultaneous raids on bridges and stations. And in this system, every small success became part of the front's grand design. Somewhere on the Belarusian roads, hundreds of trains went down the embankment. Somewhere in the Russian regions, partisan territories held dozens and hundreds of settlements. And somewhere in Ukraine, an entire network lived underground, whispering to the front what the enemy was preparing for tomorrow. Thus, from the forest whisper, from patience, from the craft, a force was born that the enemy long failed to calculate, because it was measured not only in figures, but also in shattered confidence, when the path that seemed straight suddenly turned out to be long and shaky. And if you try to gather everything into one calm word, it will be this: partisan warfare is when the enemy's rear ceases to be a rear and turns into a field where every bush is watching and every swamp knows someone's name. And it is on this field that foreign haste is broken and our victory matures. And ahead of us awaits a conversation not about trails and explosions, but about what sustained people on this path, about the quiet, stubborn strength of the heart, which is usually called by the simple word patriotism, and which was enough for everyone in that war. Sometimes, when I close my eyes and try to hear that war, what rises before my inner ear is not the roar of cannons, but the quiet, persistent hum of human determination, as if the whole country is holding one collective breath and not allowing itself to exhale prematurely. And in this steady breathing, the force that would later be called the moral spirit of the victors is born. From the very first days, this was not just a war for borders on a map, but a war for home, for children, for the right to speak with one's own voice. And therefore, it immediately became truly patriotic, where the justice of the goal illuminated even the darkest sections of the road. When the goal is clear to the point of pain and simplicity, people develop that special energy that lifts them to exploit without command and without expectation of reward. And in those years, this energy was enough for both the front line and the deep rear. In the first hours of mortal threat to the country, words were sounded that work like a tuning fork: to remain calm, to believe in the just cause, to fight for every inch of land, and to hold on so that the enemy tired before us. And in this clear intonation, there was neither hysteria nor falsehood. Very soon, this voice became stricter and firmer, demanding that all life be restructured to a military footing, driving away complacency and calling things by their names, because the time demanded not eloquence, but focus. And at the same time, a short and precise directive appeared on how to live in the occupied land: to unite, to help each other, to disrupt the enemy's plans, not to let him feel at home, so that every day there would be long and prickly for him. The state and society quickly found a common language of simple symbols that heal fear and provide support. The parade in Moscow, the new anthem, The return of shoulder boards, guards titles, orders bearing the names of old military leaders. This was not about uniforms, but about memory and continuity, about the feeling that the people have deep roots and strong shoulders. The names of units that received titles based on liberated cities had the same meaning, as if the country's map itself was thawing and returning home, and every such name sounded like a promise that none of it was in vain and everything would be seen through to the end. And the more clear signs and understandable words there were, the more confidently people held on between the reports, because symbols gather what escapes dry figures: hope, patience, and quiet pride. This chapter also has its cornerstone, and its name is the Brest Fortress, where wounded walls spoke louder than loudspeakers, reminding all of us that one can hold out against common sense if a foreign boot is nearby and your home is behind you. The history of its defense became not just a page of the chronicle, but a source of inner support for those who went into battle later, because an example experienced by the heart is stronger than any instruction. And this is how the simple phrase that "we die but do not surrender" entered the bloodstream of the generation. And everyone who heard about these basements, about the lack of water, and about the last cartridges, understood without excessive words why the next line of defense stood and why they were not retreating from it. But the patriotism of those years is not only the feat of the garrison and attacks under heavy fire, it is also the inconspicuous daily life: sharing a piece of bread, supporting a neighbor, coming to a shift earlier and leaving later, rewriting a letter for a wounded person so that he could make out every letter of hope. Thus, the front and the rear intertwined into a single breath, and it was no longer possible to separate the rifleman in his greatcoat from the woman at the machine tool, because their common meaning was stronger than distances and positions, and the sense of necessity became the habit of the day. It was this sense of the collective necessity of every labor and every life that created that invisible armature on which the entire burden of the long years of trial rested. Of course, alongside soft words, there were strict ones, and the authorities did not hide harsh measures to maintain order and prevent panic from spoiling the Army's spirit. But more importantly, an explanation of the goal and shared responsibility was always added to the strictness. Political work at the front and in the rear ceased to be a formality, transforming into a conversation about what was worth enduring for and how the support of today differed from yesterday's. And there was more meaning than slogans in this conversation. When people see that they are being spoken to honestly and practically, they respond in kind. And this honesty also becomes part of the moral force, like a well-fitted belt that does not cut but holds. It might seem that spirit is an intangible thing, but it manifests quite materially, in how a soldier gets up after a short rest, in how a nurse drags one more person along, in how an old man at the station helps unload sacks without being asked or complaining. And if you put a million such small actions together into one large pattern, it becomes clear where that very endurance came from, which allowed them to withstand the shock of the beginning and arrive at the clarity of the end. This is the simple, quiet truth about popular patriotism: love for home, translated into the habit of action, without posturing and without noise, but with that inner smile that is audible even across the years. And when asked what the moral victory over the enemy consisted of, the answer sounds quiet but firm, in the fact that hatred was not allowed to consume the soul, that values proved stronger than fear, and certainty in righteousness stronger than iron, and therefore nothing visible could break the invisible. That is how the voice of the time was remembered, even, warm, without hysteria, but with a firm back. And with this voice, the country said to itself and the world, "Our cause is just," which means there will be enough strength to reach the last line and put a full stop where it should be. And in this last phrase, there are no loud words, only the calm confidence of people who are accustomed to being responsible for what is said and done. And such a habit is itself the firm foundation of any victory. When you think about the Great War, you are always a little surprised. How could such an experienced and technically powerful opponent make so many miscalculations, as if he had forgotten all his textbooks and believed his own propaganda? And the most interesting thing is that it was precisely this belief in an easy victory that became his first step toward defeat. The main mistake sounded almost like a slogan when the Reich leadership repeated the phrase about the colossus with feet of clay, not suspecting that the real clay was their own perceptions of the Soviet Union, which would crumble at the very first encounter with harsh reality. Simplifying the enemy is always a door through which surprise enters, and when the German divisions were convinced that the Russians were standing where they should have surrendered according to the plan, it became clear that the map and the terrain differed too greatly. At the core of the plan lay a simple but very risky idea: to defeat the Red Army in a short campaign before autumn, reach a line from the northern seas to distant rivers, and declare the war over, not even allowing the thought that winter and resistance might follow. They planned for 8, at most 10 weeks, as if it were not about a large country, but a small campaign somewhere in Europe, where roads are smooth and distance is measured in days of marching, not weeks without end. None of them wanted to seriously consider what would happen if these weeks turned into months and the country did not collapse like a house of cards, but began to gather strength where it was not visible from the front line. Underestimation proceeded in all directions at once: resources, mobilization, equipment, the will to resist. On every point, German intelligence and planning lowered the figures as if it were not analytical work, but wishful thinking. Hitler refused to believe his own intelligence data regarding the number of Soviet tanks and aircraft, because in that case, he would have had to admit that the idea of a quick strike was risky, and he was not ready for such an admission, even to himself. When the army encountered the T-34, when the Ils began striking columns, when the Katyushas first fired a salvo, the German military understood that they were being led on a campaign without half the information. But it was already too late. The invasion machine was already moving, and it could not be turned back. A simple and very serious mistake: the lack of a contingency forecast in case of failure. There were no reserves, no winter uniforms, no calculation for the path being longer. The resistance, more stubborn, and the losses, more dreadful. As soon as the plan began to stall and the very first winter fell upon an army unprepared for the cold, it was revealed that, despite all its technical power, the German machine was assembled for a short road, not for a long journey through snow, mud, and popular persistence. In the headquarters, no one included in the calculations the fact that combat strength melts away with every kilometer from the base, that echelons travel longer, that aviation cannot reach everywhere, and that the forest and swamp stifle any maneuver, turning polished tactics into viscous improvisation. Another mistake, which is often overlooked but which held immense significance, is the occupation policy: cruel, inhumane, and short on foresight. The Nazis came to our land not as liberators, although some might have been tempted by such a game, but as executioners, destroying villages, hanging people, turning the occupation into hell, where survival was possible only through resistance. This policy dug its own hole, because every burned house, every executed family added several new fighters to the partisan detachment, ready to take revenge and seek no compromises. Had the Germans played differently, the war might have followed a different scenario, but they chose racial hatred instead of political flexibility, and this decision cost them very dearly. The enemy's rear became the front, the railways, the battlefield, and every forest, a shelter for those who would not forgive or forget. And this second front within the front drained forces from the army, forcing them to keep entire units there, where they were useless for the main strike. In this sense, the cruelty of the occupation became not a strength, but a weakness, because it turned millions of people from potentially neutral into absolutely hostile, and this hostility became material, measured in hundreds of blown-up bridges and thousands of disrupted transports. Finally, a miscalculation in the strategy itself. Dispersal of effort, hesitation between Moscow, Leningrad, and the South, disputes among generals about where to strike the main blow, and all these disputes consumed time, which was already scarce. In the summer of the 41st year, when the enemy was close to the capital and could have attempted to take it immediately, Hitler redirected part of his forces to other directions, thinking he would still have time, but he did not have time. The cold arrived, reserves approached, and Moscow held out. This was not a one-day mistake. It was systemic short-sightedness, where every choice was made based on a feeling of ease and not based on calculation for complexity. And gradually this ease turned into a burden that the German army could no longer shed. Thus, the picture comes together. Underestimation of the enemy, lack of a plan B, unpreparedness for winter, cruel occupation that turns the rear into a front, and strategic wavering between goals. All this together created that gap between intent and reality that became obvious by the end of the first year and fatal by the second. It is interesting that many German generals after the war would claim that they knew everything, warned about everything, but the Führer did not listen. However, the truth is that almost the entire general staff supported the plan and believed in its feasibility until reality shattered that belief. The enemy's mistakes became part of our victory because they gave us time to gather, time to evacuate the factories, time to raise the people and make them feel that the enemy was not omnipotent, that he could get tired, freeze, and lose if he encountered a persistence that was stronger than his plans. And therefore, when we talk about the reasons for the victory, we cannot forget this quiet but important factor. The enemy himself helped us win time and space to reorganize and give an answer that he did not expect and was not ready for because he was preparing for a different war, a short, light, triumphal one. But he received a long, heavy one that ended in defeat. Ahead of us awaits a conversation about who held this entire complex system in their hands and guided it through trials, about the role of the political leadership, its decisions, and its price. Because any war is not only about soldiers and factories, but also about those who make decisions at the top. When you try to understand who held the entire mechanism of war in their hands and was the final authority where all the threads of control converged, only one name will sound: Iosif Vissarionovich Stalin, and it was upon his shoulders that the responsibility lay for all the decisions, all the successes, and all the mistakes that collectively led to victory, although the path to it was long, heavy, and full of trials. In the beginning of August of the 41st year, he concentrated the full extent of political and military power in his hands, becoming the Supreme Commander-in-Chief and Chairman of the State Defense Committee, thereby uniting the political and military leadership in one person, a centralized, rigid system that did not permit inconsistency. This was not a simple formality. It was a way to organize the country so that every decision was carried out quickly, clearly, and without disputes between the civil and military authorities, because war does not tolerate lack of coordination when the survival of an entire civilization is at stake. In those anxious months when the enemy stood at the gates of Moscow, the government and the diplomatic corps were evacuated to Kuibyshev, but Stalin remained in the capital, and this decision was not just a symbolic gesture. It told the army and the entire people that the leadership had not fled, had not surrendered, was standing firm, and would stand until the end. On the 7th of November, at the parade, directly from the tribune, he delivered a speech where the words about victory sounded not like a fantasy, but like the confidence of a man who had already calculated his move and knew what to do next. And many remembered this moment as a point of support during the darkest time. Thus, that very atmosphere emerged, where people knew there is order at the top. They are thinking, deciding, taking responsibility at the top. And this frees those who fight and work from fuss, allowing them to focus on their task without looking back. His role as a military leader was connected not so much with operational tactics on the ground as with grand strategy, coordination of fronts, and resource allocation. He was able to see the entire map at once, sensed where to reinforce, where to take a risk, where it was better to slow down and accumulate strength for the decisive blow. At the same time, it is important that he knew how to select and support talented military leaders. Zhukov, Vasilevsky, Rokossovsky, Konev, all of them received the opportunity to prove themselves precisely because they were noticed, placed in key positions, and given freedom of action where it was necessary. Of course, relationships with them varied. In some places, heated arguments, in others, directive firmness. But over time, a language of mutual understanding developed, where the Supreme Commander listened to the experience of the commanders, and the commanders knew that their opinion was heard and considered. The headquarters of the Supreme High Command became the center where all information about the state of the fronts, fleets, reserves, industry, and supply was gathered, and where strategic decisions were made, not hastily, but after discussions with the general staff, commanders, and statesmen. This was not monarchical sole authority, but a system of collective discussion with single command in the final choice. And such a system, despite its rigidity, allowed decisions to be made quickly and implemented without bureaucratic delays. Directive economic planning, the prioritization of the defense industry, the tightening of labor legislation even before the war, all this created the very framework on which the war machine rested, and this framework was built under his personal control and responsibility. But history demands honesty, and therefore one cannot overlook the mistakes of the initial period of the war: underestimation of the threat, belated measures for defense preparation, reliance on treaties where caution was needed, and this resulted in the catastrophe of the summer of the 41st year, when the Army suffered defeats, lost equipment, and retreated under the blows of a well-prepared enemy. The first month showed that pre-war notions of a swift victory and offensive strategy proved to be an illusion, and Stalin, being a realist, understood this and began to learn from reality, adjusting his views and listening to military professionals more than before. Zhukov would later say that Stalin became a worthy supreme commander-in-chief. This assessment is worth a lot, because it is given by a marshal who knew the price of mistakes and knew the price of correct decisions. Gradually, through the failures of the winter of the 42nd and the defeats of the spring-summer of the same year, a system was developed where strategic planning relied on the experience of the fronts, where the general staff was listened to, and where they were not shy about changing the approach if it was not working. This was a school of war for everyone, including the supreme commander himself, and the ability to learn proved no less important than the ability to command, because war is not chess, where the rules are immutable, but a living process where every day brings something new and requires flexibility. Ultimately, a coordinated system developed. The general staff prepared proposals, front commanders provided assessments from the ground, the headquarters discussed, and the supreme commander made the final decision, taking full responsibility. And this system withstood the test of war. Stalin's leadership was rigid, demanding, sometimes ruthless, but at the same time effective in the conditions of total war, where the existence of the state and the people was at stake. He managed to create a mechanism where every part knew its place and its task, where the front and the rear worked as a single unit, where resources went where they were most needed, and where there was no place for complacency, because the enemy did not allow time to ramp up. And ultimately, it was precisely this ability to mobilize everything and everyone, to keep a finger on the pulse, not to lose sight of the big picture, and yet learn from mistakes that became one of the components of the victory we speak of today. When asked what ultimately decided the outcome of the war, one wants to answer honestly. There was no single magic key. There was no sole reason that outweighed everything else, because victory was born from the intertwining of dozens of factors, working together, reinforcing each other, like voices in a choir. No country in the Second World War accomplished anything similar to what the Soviet Union achieved, moving 1,500 factories, 20 million people, thousands of kilometers, restoring production in an open field in 1.5 months, and thereby not just surviving, but winning. This is a unique historical experience that demonstrated what a people is capable of when it has a clear goal, strong will, and a management system capable of mobilizing all resources without reservation. And in this uniqueness, there is no place for arrogance. There is a place for quiet gratitude to those people who bore this incredible burden on their shoulders and did not break under its weight. The historical significance of the USSR's victory cannot be overstated. It was on the Eastern Front that the spine of the Nazi machine was broken. It was the Soviet armies that liberated Europe from the Brown Plague. And it was this victory that determined the world order for decades to come. Without the Soviet resistance, without Stalingrad and Kursk, without the long road from Moscow to Berlin, the world would be completely different. And therefore the memory of this victory belongs not only to us, but to all humanity. This was not just a military victory. It was a moral verdict against an ideology that considered some people superior to others. And this verdict still rings out today as a reminder that humanity is stronger than hatred. But one cannot talk about victory without talking about its price. and that price was monstrous. Tens of millions killed, ruined cities, burned villages, crippled fates, orphaned families. Every family lost someone, a father, brother, son, mother, sister, daughter, and this pain passed through generations, leaving a scar that does not completely heal. The material destruction was such that the country recovered for long years, rebuilding anew what had been turned into ash. And in this recovery, there was also a feat of peacetime, no less important than the military feat. What lessons, then, can we draw from that war for today? The first and main one, the importance of national unity when personal interests recede before a common goal, and this unity becomes impenetrable armor that no weapon can breach. The second, the readiness for self-sacrifice not as something heroic and distant, but as a natural choice when home, family, and the future of children are at stake. The third, the necessity of a strong economy that can quickly restructure itself for defense needs, because without an economic base, any army turns into a helpless crowd. The fourth, the professionalism of the army and its command, because patriotism without the ability to fight leads only to casualties, not to victories. And the last, but no less important lesson, the need to preserve the historical truth about the war, because when history is forgotten or distorted, the road opens up for new tragedies. The memory of heroes is not just museums and monuments, although they are important. It is a living tradition of transmitting experience, values, and an understanding of what the true price of peace is and why it must be protected. Every time we utter words of gratitude to those who did not return from the front, to those who worked in the rear until exhaustion, to those who fought in partisan detachments, to those who led the country in those terrible years, we are not just remembering the past, we are building the future on a solid foundation. The victory in the Great Patriotic War was not an accident, not luck, not the result of a single factor's action. It was the inevitable consequence of the country and the people proving capable of the impossible when it became necessary. And in this capacity for the impossible, in this ability to gather oneself, endure, work, fight, and win, lies the main secret of that war and the main lesson for all times. Because as long as the memory lives, as long as we understand the price of what was done, as long as we pass this memory on, victory continues to live, protecting us from oblivion, from frivolity, from repeating the mistakes of the past. Thank you for your attention, for walking this long path with me from the evacuation echelons to the Berlin Reichstag. And may this history remain with you not as a set of facts and dates, but as a living sense of the grandeur of the human spirit that is stronger than any war.